Ancestors in My DNA by M. Warren Cox. Prologue. Snowmelt seeped deep into the ground before dripping from hairline cracks in the concrete above him. The echo of drops striking the wet floor provided the only sound in the cold and dark corridor. The youthful face of a dark-haired man appears between foggy breaths, illuminated by pulsating lights coming from both sides of the thick-glassed rectangular slit of a window through which he is watching. His fingers are trembling over a small red button on the wall next to the window. Why am I hesitating? He knew the answer, of course, but had to subdue the thought in order to carry out what he must do now and do quickly before any doubts could return. This one was indeed much better than the others had been, he thought, as he viewed the back of an unconscious figure wrapped in a white robe and lying still on a metal table in the small and otherwise empty room beyond the window. Each had been an improvement, but this one was superior by far. It had almost been a keeper. He had never experienced this feeling before, but it didn't matter. Room must be made for the next one, the last one. With renewed resolve, he tightened his lips while his forefinger stopped shaking long enough to find its target. Huge flames roared to life immediately and engulfed the entire room beyond. The sudden brightness forced him to look away, but not until he glimpsed the figure jerking violently before succumbing to the incineration that reduced it to ashes within a minute. And then the blaze ended as quickly as it had started. Had he finally committed murder, then? Of course not. He shook his head to banish the thought. This was no time for distractions. The final piece of the puzzle was in sight now, and he knew how to make the next one even better. It would be deployable, a keeper for sure, and it would owe its long life to the persistence of its creator and to that pile of ashes in there, and to all the piles of ashes that came before. Chapter 1, A New Voice.
Keep a wary eye on those two,
Barked a gravelly voice from nowhere.
There's evil there, boy.
It wasn't a suggestion, or even a request, but was more like a command. The hairs on the back of Jesse's neck were still standing when he removed his hands from the floor and sat back against the wall of the darkened room. He lifted his head slowly while the vertigo subsided. The feeling was familiar to him by now, though it was usually less intense than what he had just experienced. The vertigo meant the voice wasn't from his own mind. But who was speaking this time? He didn't recognize this voice, so he couldn't attach a name to it. He concluded that a new ancestor must have been talking to him. Whoever was speaking, Jesse somehow knew that he was right. Yes, the voice was definitely male. He resolved to watch the brothers more carefully from here on out as a result. He was fully recovered now, and pleased to find that he had succeeded in keeping quiet during the episode. His position in the space behind the escalator had not been given away, and so he could proceed with his task. He tried to catch up on what he'd missed by listening carefully to the conversation happening just off the darkened hallway in front of him. There was nothing about the conversation that should have precipitated an episode, and yet something had awoken the mind of a concerned ancestor who had just spoken to him for the very first time. An ancestor who knew something about this situation that the others didn't. But what could that something be? Jesse attempted to summon the ancestor by focusing his concentration in the way the brothers had been teaching his family for months. He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, blocked everything else out of his mind, and relaxed to the brink of unconsciousness. But no reply came. More likely, he realized, he was simply unable to detect it. He tried again. Nothing. It must be a very old ancestor. If so, it will take time to strengthen the connection sufficiently for a two-way conversation. But it was the middle of the night now, and he was exhausted. He just wanted to return to his comfortable bed in his comfortable room upstairs and think about all of this later. The holocom ended abruptly and jarred Jesse from his sleepy thoughts. He jerked awake so wildly that his finger fell off the button he had been depressing to keep the room lights from sensing him and turning on. His presence was immediately detected, and the entire area flooded with light. His fully dilated pupils were unprepared for the sudden brightness that hurt his head while blinding him. In one movement, He shielded his eyes with his hands, turned away from the lights, and leaped to his feet. His father would have seen the light and would have heard something, so he had no choice but to continue down the hallway that separated the great room on the left from his parents' rooms on the right. He had to move quickly before his father came out of his office, and he had to hope he didn't notice that the escalator wasn't running as it would be if he'd just barely come down that way. He jumped into the hallway, paused for only a second to gather himself, and then began walking slowly and purposefully towards the kitchen while rubbing his eyes, which were still adjusting to the light. He pretended to be surprised by his father's presence in the doorway of his office as he passed by.
"We were just discussing the prototype chip, Jesse,"
said Hagen in answer to an unasked question as he put on sunglasses against the lights in the room outside the office. Like most people, he'd had intraocular shades implanted as a child, but, unlike most people, he insisted on also wearing their precursor as a second line of defense against bright lights. Hagen's face was flushed, probably from pacing. His hands were placed awkwardly on his waist with one slightly higher than the other. He never seemed to know just what to do with his hands while speaking, and often ended up striking strange, sometimes humorous poses. To the few who knew him well, this was a clue that something was bothering him.
"Who? What?"
asked Jesse, rubbing his eyes again and feigning ignorance. He was quite pleased with the quality of his impromptu performance so far. His brother Gus would be proud.
"Who?" "The brothers, Jesse. The brothers,"
said Hagen laboriously, as if he knew that Jesse had been eavesdropping and was disappointed that he wasn't going to admit it. He had little patience for the face-saving games that often accompanied dishonesty. Hagen seldom expressed strong emotion, and so even the slight tone that was in his voice now told Jesse that he was pretty upset. After pretending to take a moment to catch up, Jesse asked with a yawn,
"Oh, the brothers, the chip. What did you tell them?"
Jesse went from pretend sleepiness to full wakefulness by the time he reached the end of his question. He'd only overheard his dad and the brothers engage in small talk before the episode overtook him, and so he didn't realize they were talking about the new chip. That part of the conversation must have happened during the episode, and the fact that they were discussing it in the middle of the night and outside the presence of the rest of the family was a bit disturbing.
"What did I tell them?"
repeated Hagen. Jesse's mom once explained that his dad's repeating of questions was a symptom of his condition and was a way of buying more time to formulate a response. Hagen had been diagnosed with level 1 autism as a baby. Because his symptoms were slight, he had managed to live a relatively normal life. In fact, most people knew nothing of his condition and believed he was just a little bit quirky.
"We'll discuss it with everyone tomorrow,"
said Hagen curtly.
"Go back to bed, son. After you get whatever it was that you wanted from the kitchen, of course."
"Oh, I'm okay, Dad.
Said Jesse as he turned around.
Not really hungry after all, I guess. Good night."
He waved feebly with the back of his hand as he shuffled away. Hagen said,
"Good night, Jesse. And no more sneaking around."
Unfortunately, Hagen would not be able to take his own advice. He hadn't slept well for days, but the decision was finally made now, and so maybe tonight would be different. Jesse looked back downstairs after he stepped off the escalator. Behind his father, he could barely make out his mother leaning against their bedroom doorway. Has she been there the whole time? If so, she remained unusually silent during my exchange with Dad. She lifted a hand to her face and made a sound. Is she yawning? Or maybe crying? The great room was dark again, so it was impossible to be sure. Jesse opened his mouth to speak but closed it again after resigning to obey his dad and say nothing more tonight. He didn't want to press his luck any further anyway. He could barely discern the silhouette of a wave after they turned to enter their bedroom. Jesse's gaze then drifted from his mother to his father, who had returned to the doorway and was staring up at him now, waiting for him to find his room. Jesse turned and continued down the hall. Sleep was the best option for everyone at this point. Anything Jesse had to say was better said tomorrow when they were all rested and together with his siblings. What about the chip, though? He still felt strongly that he and Gus were better suited to take the new chip first. but several attempts had failed to convince their parents. By this point, Hagen could detect and deflect any attempt to change his mind before it could even be vocalized. They needed to find an argument that their parents would accept, and they needed to find a way of expressing it that would keep the lines of communication open long enough to break through their initial resistance. And they needed to find both right away. Tonight's holocom meant they were running out of time. Without slowing his pace, Jesse scanned his older brother's room as he walked past, but it was empty. Gus wasn't home. He was often out late these days, and he wouldn't answer comms either. Gus had a highly developed and amazing talent for staying off the grid when he wanted to. Jesse would have to wait until the morning to talk to him, but that might be cutting it too close. He considered going out and trying to find him, but he could still feel his dad's eyes and ears waiting for confirmation that he had gone inside his room. He continued past his sister's room and entered his own room at the end of the hallway. The room lightened slightly as he entered and darkened again after he fell onto his bed. The walls and ceiling glowed faintly and began to move with the new somnolent pattern he had downloaded yesterday. The pattern became more distinguishable as his eyes adjusted to the darkness again. Soft and airy music matched the rhythm of the changing shapes, but he couldn't be sure if the music was following the shapes or if the shapes were reacting to the music. Either way, the effect was both mesmerizing and relaxing. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the instruments that produced them were unidentifiable. The section of music that finished just now might have been from an oboe combined with a French horn, or maybe some type of Asian instrument. The shapes were of many sizes and colors that adjusted automatically to his wakefulness, becoming less vivid as he began to drift. They traveled slowly about the room, filling the entire space, some coalescing and others colliding before breaking into thousands of tiny, irregularly shaped pieces that drifted aimlessly around him before coming together again. After several minutes, Jesse's thoughts were still winning against the pattern's effect, and so he decided to sit up and try to establish a connection with the new ancestor again. Whether it worked or not, the effort would make him more tired and might help him get to sleep. But after several failed attempts, he gave up the effort. Who could it be? Was it the voice of this new ancestor that had awoken him before he heard the holocom and went downstairs earlier? How credible was their opinion in this particular situation? Sometimes Jesse disagreed with his ancestors and had been proved right to do so. More often, he ignored their advice at the risk of personal pain and embarrassment. This ancestor seemed very confident, and so he was inclined to believe him. But he needed to know who exactly he was believing. He decided to ask his great-great-great-grandfather for help. Grandpa Ship had passed away just before the end of natural death across the world. He lived to be only 71, which was considered young even then. He and Grandma Ship were injured after their car slipped on some ice and ran off the road where it caught the edge of a culvert that stopped them instantly. Grandma Ship suffered a few cuts, dehydration, and a broken thigh, while Grandpa Ship had deep lacerations and bled to death at the scene just after the paramedics arrived. The paramedics often took several minutes or longer to arrive back then. They were able to revive him, but they couldn't stop his bleeding sufficiently and he passed away before they could get to the hospital. That scenario could never happen today, thought Jesse. The paramedics would have been alerted sooner, they would have arrived much sooner, and they would have been able to stabilize him more easily. They probably could have stabilized him before they even got there if he'd had a birth chip. But those wouldn't be required in the U.S. for another 20 years. So, Grandpa Ship had just barely missed out on several technological advances that would have saved his life. But because he had died relatively recently, compared to other ancestors, contacting him was easy for Jesse now, almost effortless. He closed his eyes.
Yes, Jesse?
Came the immediate response to Jesse's mind.
Who spoke earlier and asked me to watch out for the brothers?
Jesse asked with a thought, getting straight to the point.
I'm not sure. He's older than me, though, much older. We didn't use words like wary in my day. Could be from my father's side. He didn't talk about his people much.
Can you ask your father about him then?
Asked Jesse.
Sorry, grandson, you know it doesn't work that way. Either you summon us, or we come forth ourselves when you need us. We can't talk to each other. At least I don't know how anyways. You'll have to ask him yourself.
But Dad doesn't summon anyone, and I don't think ancestors are coming forth just to torment him with the irrelevant noise he hears all the time.
Countered Jesse.
I only know what you know about your father, of course, and from what you know, I'd say he summons them all right.
Said Grandpa Ship.
He's probably just unaware of doing it and can't control it very well. Not like you and Gus can, anyway.
Well, if your father had any useful information, he probably would have considered himself summoned by now.
Said Jesse, who was becoming even more exhausted by this conversation and disappointed that it hadn't led to anything useful. Jesse cracked his eyelids until he could just barely make out the blurry and muted pattern on the ceiling. The movement of the shapes was indeed beautiful. He thought he may have just detected a repeated rhythm in the collisions of the orange ones, so maybe they aren't random after all. He opened his eyes a bit further and focused on the shapes for several minutes to test his hypothesis, but was having trouble holding the memory of the previous cycle in his head, long enough to compare them, and couldn't be sure anymore. He shifted his focus to the purple ones until he began drifting again.
I suppose so,
Said Grandpa Ship slowly and quietly after a very long pause in the conversation. He then whispered,
That reminds me of something I remembered about your father.
That's impossible. You died before he was born.
Jesse yawned.
You can't have memories of him.
Grandpa Ship completely ignored Jesse's valid observation and waited another minute until he was mostly asleep before continuing, whispering again.
He was lying still on a table on the opposite side of a large warehouse. It was very odd. I wondered what he was doing on that table and why he wasn't in bed where he ought to be. I called out to him, but he didn't answer.
Jesse began feeling a little lightheaded and thought he understood what was happening. The episode was morphing into a dream. That happened sometimes with Grandpa Ship, who preferred the imagery of dreams to saying things straight out. Jesse decided to play along and continued relaxing into the story. He was too tired to fight it anyway. He found it easy to imagine his dad lying on that table. Grandpa Ship continued.
I called out to him again and again, more loudly each time. Hagen, Hagen, Hagen! But there was no answer. So, we began walking towards the table, you and me. He was on the far side of that big room, so it took a good while for us to get to him. By the time we arrived, that huge room had become completely dark. We both called to him this time, but he still wouldn't stir. I became so frustrated that I shook him gently at first and then harder, all the while calling his name.
Why won't he wake up?
Asked dreaming Jesse.
I commanded the lights, but they wouldn't respond. They must be offline. That's when you handed me your comm to use as a light,
Said Grandpa Ship.
Yes!
Mumbled Jesse.
My comm light.
But the light was dim because something was covering it. So, I asked you what was smudged all over the comm, obscuring its light, and you said you didn't know.
He continued.
You looked at it, smirked, and said I had smudged it myself. I laughed because you were right. The smudge had indeed come from my own hands. But what was on my hands? That's when I pointed the light at your father and we both saw it.
Blood! All over his clothes!
Shrieked Jesse.
Dad!
Blood everywhere. We walked around the table to see what had happened, and that's when we saw something so terrible.
His head. The top is. It's open! Where is his brain?
Exclaimed Jesse, feeling as though he had been punched in the gut hard by Gus. He turned away and doubled over as if he was going to be sick.
Yes, we both jumped back when we saw that gruesome sight,
Said Grandpa Ship, patting Jesse on the back to calm him.
You started calling for help, and that's when we heard the laughter echoing from another corner of the room.
Who's over there?
Asked Jesse, whose shock and nausea had suddenly turned to anger.
Can they hear us? Why are they laughing? There is nothing funny about this. Why aren't they helping us? Did they do this to him? Did they see what happened?
I tried to get the lights to come on again so we could see them better,
Said Grandpa Ship.
but only a single dim light appeared directly over their heads.
They're only children. Who are they? I don't think they are laughing at us. They appear to be.
Started Jesse.
Playing. Yes, I wondered where their mom and dad were,
said Grandpa Ship.
They were too young to be out alone like that. We started over to see if they needed help finding their parents and to ask them if they knew anything about what had happened to your father. All the while, they just kept on playing and laughing. When they saw us coming, they tried to stop laughing by shushing each other repeatedly, but that only made them laugh even more. Just as we arrived, the bigger boy missed catching a ball thrown by the smaller one and laughter exploded from both of them again. That's when you noticed his hands.
I see his hands, but what am I supposed to notice?
Asked Jesse. Ignoring the question, Grandpa Ship continued.
The smaller boy looked at you and smiled warmly as he caught the ball. He seemed to know you.
Yes, but I don't know him, do I?
Asked Jesse.
He threw the ball back to the bigger boy,
said Grandpa.
The bigger one's hands are filthy,
observed Jesse.
I see it now.
The bigger boy dropped the ball again and the laughter erupted all over again, even more loudly than before. Then he turned and smiled at you as well.
Yes, but his smile is different,
observed Jesse.
Especially when he turned away just then. Did you see it, Grandpa? Something in his eyes?
That's when you noticed the ball,
said Grandpa.
It is a very strange ball, isn't it?
Noted Jesse.
Not really a ball at all, I think. Not round, more oblong, kind of like a football, except it's dripping wet. That's odd. That must be what's getting on the bigger boy's hands. No wonder he keeps dropping it. Wait!
Jesse turned away in disgust when he realized what they were throwing around. Again, he felt as though he might vomit, so he bent over at the waist to prepare. He suddenly remembered he was dreaming and realized the sudden shock was causing him to awaken. He had so many questions to ask Grandpa, but had time for just one. With desperate eyes, Jesse turned and faced his grandpa again, who was already beginning to fade away, and asked quickly,
Why aren't the smaller kids' hands dirty from handling?
Jesse gulped.
Dad's brain?
Grandpa Ship reached up and squeezed his shoulder gently. He smiled warmly as he looked into Jesse's eyes and answered with a sort of finality as he continued to fade.
I don't know, Jesse, but I believe that is the right question to ask. You'll figure it out, grandson. After all, you've already gotten this far. Goodbye for now.
The whole scene dissolved instantly, and Jesse found himself wide awake in his bed, breathing heavily. He bolted upright. The shapes and music immediately surrendered to the room lights and silence. The only sound now was that of his heart pounding furiously. It took several minutes to compose himself and slow his breathing. When he was finally able to think again, he remembered that this happened sometimes with Grandpa Ship. He was a dramatic sort. Truth, he believed, was better shown than explained. Jesse had to admit that it was a very effective method of teaching. You tended to remember things that almost gave you a heart attack after all. Indeed, there was always some kind of point to these dreams, some truth that Grandpa Ship was trying to teach him. What truth am I supposed to learn from this? Is the dream related to the warning from the new ancestor? It couldn't be. That would suggest the ancestors were collaborating, and there was no precedent for that. Grandpa Ship himself had reminded him of that only moments ago. But then, there was still so much about their That's the end of the first chapter.